Chapter 3, Seeds of Ambition, Chicago the Rails, 1871. The years under the Pinkerton banner had been a masterclass. George Thiel, now a seasoned operative in his late 20s, bore the mark of the agency's rigorous training and relentless pace. He was leaner, his gaze even more watchful, if that were possible. He'd chased counterfeiters through the smoky warrens of Philadelphia, a pursuit that had involved days of patient observation and a final heart-pounding chase through a crowded market. "Got him," he'd muttered, collaring the forger just as the man tried to slip onto a departing ferry. He'd infiltrated gangs of river pirates on the Mississippi, posing as a disgruntled deckhand. "Heard you boys are looking for someone who ain't afraid to get his hands dirty," he'd said to a hulking brute in a dockside tavern, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The information he'd gathered had led to a coordinated takedown by local authorities, guided by Pinkerton intelligence. He'd stood guard over express wagons laden with gold dust in the raw, burgeoning towns of the West, the crack of the driver's whip a counterpoint to the nervous thumping of his own heart as they rumbled through bandit country. His reports were models of clarity and detail, his ability to disappear into a role legendary among the newer recruits. "How do you do it, Thiel?" a fresh-faced operative named Miller had asked him once, wide-eyed after Thiel had recounted a particularly subtle piece of surveillance. "You become the part, Miller," George had replied, his voice quiet. "You don't just act it. You think like them. You walk like them. You are them. Until the job is done." He had earned a reputation for being cool-headed, resourceful, and, above all, effective. McParland, his initial mentor, would sometimes nod approvingly when reviewing Thiel's files. "Good work, Thiel. Clean, precise." That was high praise from McParland. Yet a quiet restlessness had begun to take root, a subtle chafing against the very structure that had molded him. It wasn't a lack of loyalty, nor a disagreement with the fundamental aims of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Rather, it was the dawning realization that the Pinkerton shadow, while vast and protective, also limited the light. He saw it in the way assignments were handed down. The case manager, often a man with less field experience than Thiel himself, would summon him. "Thiel, report to Mr. Henderson, robbery on the Illinois Central. Standard procedure. Interview, observe, report. Don't deviate from the manual." The parameters were often rigid, leaving little room for the kind of intuitive leaps and unorthodox approaches he'd found so effective during the war. But what if, he'd sometimes think, there's a better way, a quicker way? He rarely voiced these thoughts. The Pinkerton system valued conformity and adherence to established methods. He saw it in the layers of bureaucracy that had inevitably grown with the agency's size. Reports that once went directly to McParland now passed through 3 different hands, sometimes slowing response times or dulling the edge of an investigation. McParland himself had moved up, now a superintendent, more distant, more preoccupied with administrative matters. The newer breed of case managers often seem more concerned with procedure than with outcome, more focused on filling out forms correctly than on catching the culprit. "Is the paperwork in order, Thiel?" was a question he heard more often than "Have you got your man?" One particular case in the autumn of 1871 served as a lens, focusing his discontent. A series of coordinated thefts had plagued the expanding Rock Island line, vital freight vanishing from sealed cars as if by magic. Pinkerton's was naturally called in. George was part of the team. "This is sophisticated, Thiel," his team leader, a veteran agent named Barnes, had said, scratching his head over a manifest. "Cars are sealed at departure, seals intact at arrival, but the goods inside, poof, gone." through patient observation days spent shivering in a hidden spot overlooking the Chicago yards, and a daring undercover stint among a crew of disgruntled yard workers. "Call me Finn," he'd said, offering a shared bottle of cheap whiskey. "Just looking for a way to make ends meet." George had identified the culprits. It was an inside ring, a clever scheme involving a yardmaster, 2 brakemen, and a freight clerk, with connections to a Chicago-based fence. It was a clean break, a textbook Pinkerton success. Barnes clapped him on the back. "Good work, Thiel. Knew you'd crack it." But during the investigation, George had seen more than just this one ring. He'd seen systemic vulnerabilities across the entire rail line, lax security in smaller depots, inconsistent inventory checks, opportunities for theft at countless points. He proposed a broader surveillance strategy in a supplementary report, a system of anonymous testers posing as regular railroad employees across several lines, not just to catch thieves after the fact, but to act as a deterrent and gather intelligence on these systemic weaknesses. He presented his idea to Henderson, the case manager. "Mr. Henderson, if we had men on the inside, regularly, not just for specific cases." Henderson had shuffled the papers on his desk, his expression one of polite indifference. "Too broad a scope, Thiel," he'd said without looking up. "Our business is to investigate crimes reported to us. We target the guilty. We don't police the entire workforce of the Rock Island line. That's their responsibility." "But, sir," George had persisted, "if we could show them how to prevent these losses on a larger scale." "Our contract is to solve this series of thefts, Thiel," Henderson had cut him off, his tone final. "And you've done that. Good work. Now on to the next case." George held his tongue, but the manager's words rankled. Policing the workforce, or at least ensuring its honesty, was precisely what these burgeoning railroad corporations desperately needed. The rail lines were the arteries of the nation, and they were hemorrhaging profits due to internal theft and inefficiency on a scale few truly grasped. Pinkerton's, for all its prowess in hunting down notorious outlaws and quelling strikes, seemed to George to be missing the subtler, more pervasive rot within. They were masters of the dramatic confrontation, the high-profile arrest. He was beginning to see an equally vast, if less glamorous field in quiet prevention and persistent, low-visibility oversight. He also observed the agency's reputation. The name Pinkerton was a potent weapon, striking fear into the hearts of criminals and labor organizers alike. But it was also a lightning rod. In labor disputes, the appearance of Pinkerton men often inflamed tensions, their very presence a declaration of war. He'd seen it in that Pennsylvania mining town. The arrival of the Pinkerton guards hadn't calmed the situation. It had poured oil on the flames. George wondered if a less notorious agency, one operating with more discretion, might be more effective in certain delicate situations, gathering intelligence without provoking outright conflict. There must be a way, he mused one evening, staring to his boarding house fireplace, to get the information without starting a riot. The idea, at first, was a mere flicker, a thought dismissed almost as soon as it arose. Lee Pinkerton's? The premier detective agency in the world? It was madness. He was well paid, respected, with a clear path for advancement. "Don't be a fool, George," he told himself. But the seed had been planted. As he traveled the country on assignments, he saw the opportunities. He saw the vastness of the rail networks, the burgeoning factories, the mining concerns stretching into remote territories. He saw the nascent, often chaotic state of public law enforcement, ill-equipped to handle crimes that crossed county or state lines, or to delve into complex internal conspiracies within large corporations. He began to listen more intently to the talk of businessmen in hotel lobbies. "Can't trust anyone these days," a portly man in a silk vest had grumbled to a companion in the lobby of the Palmer House. My own clerks, I suspect them. But what can I do? The police are useless for such matters. He heard the frustrations of railroad superintendents. It's like water through a sieve, Thiel, one had confided in him after a case. We plug one hole, and 3 more appear. If only I knew what my men were truly up to 1,000 miles down the line. He noted the anxieties of factory owners. These union agitators, one had hissed, they're like rats in the walls. How do I find them before they burn the whole place down? There was a hunger for information, for control, for a reliable means of protecting assets and ensuring loyalty in an era of unprecedented growth and social upheaval. His mind, honed by years of observation and analysis, started to piece together a different kind of agency, one that might specialize, perhaps, in railroad security, an area he felt a particular affinity for. The railroads are the future, he thought, and they are bleeding from 1,000 cuts. One that might build a reputation for discretion as much as for effectiveness. An agency that would be his own, built on his principles, responsive to his vision. My own agency. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. He started to save his money more rigorously, setting aside a larger portion of his pay. He cultivated contacts, not just among law enforcement, but also among mid-level managers in various industries, men who might one day be clients or sources of information. He'd share a drink, listen to their troubles, offer a piece of general advice, always careful, always observant. He read voraciously not just dime novels about daring detectives, but also treatises on business management, on railway operations, on the emerging science of criminology. The entrepreneurial spirit, the same drive that had led him to risk his life as a spy when so many others sought safety, began to stir once more. The thought of being his own master, of building something from the ground up, was a powerful lure. He envisioned an agency headquartered not necessarily in Chicago, the Pinkerton stronghold. Too much shadow there, he considered. And it's not my shadow. But perhaps further west, in a city like St. Louis, a gateway to the expanding territories and a hub of river and rail traffic. The risks were immense. He would be leaving the shelter of a giant to compete against it, along with numerous other smaller detective outfits. He had no vast capital, no famous name to trade upon, save for the reputation he had built within Pinkerton's own ranks. Can I truly do this, he asked himself in the dark hours of the night? Alone? Yet the seeds of ambition, once sown, were proving difficult to ignore. George Thiel looked at the sprawling, complex, often lawless landscape of industrializing America, and he saw not just chaos, but opportunity. He saw space for a man with his unique skills, his wartime experience, and his growing, unshakable belief that he could do it better. The Pinkerton crucible had forged him into a formidable operative. Now he began to feel the heat of a new fire, one that urged him to break the mold and cast his own future. The decision was not yet made, but it was hardening within him, like iron cooling into steel. Soon, he thought, soon it will be time.